guys, welcome back to my channel. So I am mixing things up. I'm doing my romance wrap up first because I feel like it. I don't know why. I just felt like talking about these books prior to talking about the other ones, even though I'm literally going to film these back to back and upload them back to back. I just feel like discussing some stuff in the middle of the month. My wrap-ups will never go up on the first of the month. I've learned that about myself. So I'm going to format this like I always do, where I start with my lowest rated books and work my way up to my top rated books, and a bunch of these kind of are going to be intermixed just because I was reading series or books that go together, so I try and lump those together, but they generally all fall in around the same range. So let's just get started. So the first book that I want to talk about, like I said, is going to be my lowest rated book, but honestly I'm starting at 3 stars. I had a pretty solid reading month. There was very little that I read this month that I disliked. Both in romance and in everything else. So the first book I want to discuss is Handle with Care by Helena Hunting. I randomly found this to listen to from my library. I think that's where it came from. I was just like, oh, it's a Helena Hunting book. Sure, download and listen. And I listened all the way through this not knowing that this was technically, I think, book 5 in a series. I think this is the 5th book in the Shacking Up series. It didn't make a difference to me. I'm sure maybe I would have known who these characters were a little bit better, knowing that this was book 5 in a series, but I personally think this read like a standalone. There were honestly like no characters or no backstories that I like didn't fully understand in the book. This book was more, not necessarily the direction that I tend to lean in romance. I feel like there's a lot of people who like this setting of romance more so than I do. So this is like a contemporary romance that is set kind of in the business world. I tend to lean more towards like small town romances. I just enjoy a cozier setting. This one is definitely like big city corporate business type of setting. So if that's your jam, maybe this is a series for you to check out, or at least this book in general. This basically follows a woman who has been working as kind of a handler for a young businessman who is not the smartest when it comes to etiquette and how he handles himself both in the business setting and in his own personal life. And she has just been like kind of his personal assistant, but with like all aspects of his life. So this book basically takes place as she is being transferred to his brother because the father of these two guys has passed away and is leaving the company to one of them. And her duties get transferred to the other son because they feel like he might need a little bit more work because he's been living like in a third world country and is a little rough around the edges, and it follows their romance. And there is nothing particularly wrong with this book. It was just, in my mind, kind of a very stereotypical like business place romance where they end up falling for each other in a business setting. And of course there are obstacles to overcome, as there is in almost all romance stories. Ultimately, I feel like this is going to be somewhat forgettable. I gave this 3 stars. I enjoyed it. Like I said, there was nothing particularly wrong with it. It just was not, like, amazing to me. So I still love Helena Hunting's books. I'm steadily working my way through, like, all of her backlist, and this just happened to be one to check off of the list, not knowing that it was book 5 in a series. But like I said, I don't think it made a difference because it all made perfect sense to me when I was reading it. So that's where I'm standing on that one. The next 2 books I want to talk about are books 2 and 3 in a series by Corinne Michaels that I started in the previous month. The first book in the series is Say You'll Stay, and I talk about that in my romance wrap-up for August because I did start that right at the end of August and continued on in at the beginning of September, so that's where we are in this series. Book 1 blew me away. It was so well written. And book 2, I feel like, was equally as amazing. So I'm kind of going backwards with my ratings with these 2 books. I gave book 2 4 stars, but I gave book 3 3 stars. So that's kind of my 3 to 4 star transition part of this video, but it's the same series, so I feel like I should talk about them together. Book 1, like I said, it came with a whole slew of content warnings, but was really, really well written. Like, it made me super emotional from, like, page 1 of that book. And to me, that was a sign of a really good writer, just because I was so emotionally traumatized within the first, like, chapter of that book and never having met these characters before. She kind of held true to that with the second book as well, because this one is equally as traumatizing. I won't get into all of the specifics because we are getting into book 2 of a series, so we're starting to, like, get spoilery, I guess. Even though these are all kind of separate romances, you still know things, I guess, in book 2. So, discussing book 2 in this series, this is dealing with a trope that I generally don't like. I don't really know how to discuss it without, like, spoiling the book, even though it's addressed in, like, the first chapter. So, like, mini spoiler warning if you guys are going into the series. It follows the unwanted or unplanned pregnancy trope, which, from the bat, I was just like, I don't know. That's generally something that I don't enjoy. This book, though, it was very triggering, if anything relating to that realm of pregnancy and childbirth and child raising could potentially be triggering to you. Stay away from this book because it does have some content warnings that go with it. But I think it was handled really well. It was very well discussed. It was very well handled. I gave that one 4 stars, and then moving into book 3, that one, honestly, I feel like I gave it 3 stars because it didn't handle as many extreme situations as book 1 and 2 did. So book 3 is Say I'm Yours. This one was a much easier story to digest. There was definitely still some heavy things discussed, but not nearly as heavy as books 1 and 2 in this series. So that's the wrap up on that series. It's a trilogy. Books 1 and 2 I gave 4, honestly almost 5 stars to, because they were so well written about heavy things. And I'm learning that the heavier the content warnings are in romance books, the more I tend to like them. Not because of the actual content warning type of things, but just how it's handled in a book like that has been astounding in my experience so far. As a somewhat new romance reader, I just love seeing really heavy things discussed, mixed in with some romance. I feel like it tends to balance out really well. And then book 3 in that series, I gave 3 stars. Still really good. I still really recommend her as an author, but not as heavy as the first 2. Alrighty, so we are in the 4-star section. That was like my transition series. And in this, I'm going to continue on with a different series, but I read 2 more books in the Jameson Valley series by Devney Perry. So I read The Outpost and The Bitterroot Inn, which is books 4 and 5 in that series. And again, it's a romance series, so each of these books follows a completely separate couple and their story, but it does have an ongoing theme of, like, we know these characters, we know the area that they are in, and all of the things that are happening in the town. So book 4, I think, has been my favorite one so far. Book 4 is The Outpost, and it follows Beau, who is, like, the dude that I've been waiting for. He was, like, the most intriguing male lead that I was looking forward to reading about. Now, The Outpost, I am going to describe this as a kind of more simplified, less well-established version of The Simple Wild, but with so much more angst and drama in it. So if you like The Simple Wild, this is a very similar type of story, but it was, like, not as beautifully written, and there was definitely some more angsty stuff in it, but it was still the same type of stuff that I loved from that book. So it's following, like, a city girl where things happened that we found out about in previous books, where she ends up getting taken out of her element and put basically into the wilderness in an outpost building. It stays there with a very gruff mountain man type of character, and I just love that trope. I also adore the trapped in a cabin together or forced to, like, stay together type of trope situation, which also happens in this book. So it just had all the makings to be one of my favorite books in the series, and so far it's my top book in the series. I gave it 4 stars. I just adore series where it takes a, like, city girl out of her element and throws her out into, like, the gruff mountain wilderness, and she has to, like, learn how to do all of the things and take care of herself, but there's, like, a lumberjack man that she falls for, and there's sexy time. It was great. I loved it. Then that also leads me into book 5, which I also gave 4 stars. I've loved this series so far. If you're looking for a good small town romance series, this is definitely one that I'm going to recommend. So book 5 was The Bitterroot Inn, and this follows a woman who we met earlier on in the series, and it's finally her time to shine in her own little romance book. And it's basically her as she is remodeling an inn in this town and kind of being like a struggling new business owner. And she is a single mom, and it's just her romance with a guy who comes to stay at this inn, and it was adorable. I gave all of these books 4 stars, I'm pretty sure, but book 4 was definitely my favorite one out of all of the ones that I've read so far. I've read books 1 through 5 so far, so I still have 1 more to go. Now, staying in trend with the small town romances or lumberjacky type of romances that I just adore right now, There's a kitten walking by in the background. Nothing is new. Do you guys see how big she is now, though? She is like a full-blown cat already, and I am not prepared. But anyway, I started the Beard series by Penny Reed. I don't know the name of the actual series. I probably should have looked that up. But book 1 is Truth or Beard. I know you guys will recognize these covers if you're a romance reader at all. They are like the cross-stitch covers of like the facial hair of all of the guys, and honestly, I was drawn in by the covers, and then I found out that they're more like small town romances, and I was like, perfect, that's what I'm looking for. So I read the first one, which is Truth or Beard. It was so fun. I also gave it 4 stars. I gave a lot of books 4 stars this month. I just really enjoyed this. I enjoyed meeting the characters. I'm pretty sure this is kind of a spin-off series of her like knitting in the city or whatever type of series. I'm pretty sure we meet these characters in her first series, but you don't need to read it at all. I basically just really liked getting introduced to all of these brothers. It's another small town romance where we're following a whole bunch of brothers or a whole bunch of like friends of guys who are all very similar and gruff, and they all have beards, and it's a whole thing, and each of these books is obviously going to follow a different brother. So I basically just really enjoyed meeting all of these characters, and Penny Reed's writing is so freaking funny. Like, if you're looking for a much, like, more lighthearted story, like, it's still got a good, solid romance as its base, but her dialogue had me rolling. Like, I haven't laughed that hard at a book in a really long time. So if you're looking for a really fun small town romance, I'm gonna recommend this series. I've only read book 1, so I don't know how the series continues, but I love this. I gave it 4 stars. The next book I have to talk about, I finally got around to it, and I know so many people have been waiting for me to read this. I finally read Marriage for One by Ella Mays. This was so great. This is a book that was super, super trendy earlier this year, and I saw everybody reading it. It's compared to Mariana Zapata, who is like one of my favorite authors because she is the queen of the slow burn. This is another queen of the slow burn. This is definitely an author that I'm going to be checking out their other works now because this one was so stinking great. This is like a fake marriage story, which is kind of hit or miss for me. It can go either way depending on how it's handled or how it's written. So this follows Jack and Rose. I know, like Titanic. But it basically follows Jack, who is like a... Alright, I'm back after the kitten ripped my light cord out of the wall socket. That was great for it. We're back with this book. So, this book follows Jack, who is a very arrogant, conceited, quiet businessman who proposes marriage to this woman. And there's some ulterior motives that he has that we start to uncover as the story progresses. But basically, he proposes marriage to this woman so that she can open a bakery or like a cafe in this building. There's a lot of like legal stipulations that are discussed in this book that who cares about that right now. But basically, they get into this fake marriage as a business proposal. And it's the relationship that goes from there. And it is the slowest of slow burns. I loved Rose. She was a joy to read from. She was just a really fun, quirky character, and Jack was so stinking obnoxious. And I tend to not like really arrogant characters in books. I don't mind if they're like a quiet, gruff type of character, but he was just kind of like douchey for a while. But like, you start to like grow to love him over time, and so does she, and it was just a slow burn romance, and I just really enjoyed it. So I gave this one 4 stars. For these last 3 books that I'm going to discuss, they all kind of go together. So I'm first going to talk about my top book of the month. I'm jumping around here. I know, I jumped around a lot in this video. But my favorite book that I read in the romance genre, actually probably my favorite book that I read this month, was Still by Kennedy Ryan. This is no surprise to you guys. I'm obsessed with Kennedy Ryan. She's one of my favorite authors of all time, and this was just long overdue. I read Grip earlier this year, Grip and Flow, the novella and book 1 of this series, and it's easily probably one of my favorite romances of all time. I just adore Grip and Briss, and they're like my favorite couple to read about. And I was just like kind of putting this off because I didn't want their story to end at all. But the audiobook did finally come out, so I was just like, oh, I guess I'll listen to it finally. Because I listened to the first one, and the voices, like the narrators for Grip and Briss, are so good, so I kind of wanted to keep their voices in my head, so I finally listened to the audiobook of Still, and you guys, don't sleep on this series. It's so freaking good. I pitched Grip, the first book, as like an adult romance version of On the Come Up or The Hate You Give. Kennedy Ryan is really good at writing romances that are very modern and very important and discusses like very modern issues that are happening right now, but like with a romance mixed in. So like I said, it's heavy stuff, but with a balance of romance. She's one of my favorite authors of all time at this point, and this book still handles a lot of the racism issues that we see in book 1, but it also tackled some heavy things. So this is definitely a book that you should look into content warnings for. I'm not going to give it in this video just because I really don't want to spoil it for you guys, because I personally think this was beautifully handled going in blind because it hit me so hard. But if you are somebody who can easily get triggered by things, look into content warnings for this book, because I bawled my eyes out during this book. It was heavy, but it was so good. So this was my top book of the month. I gave this 5 stars. And this basically left me wanting more Kennedy Ryan, and I've been like saving some of her backlist titles for times like this when I'm just craving more of her books. So basically, I went on to read some backlist titles by her, and that was My Soul to Keep and Down to My Soul, not realizing that they are characters that are in this series. So I probably should have read those 2 books first, because those got released first. They came out a long time ago. They came out a couple years ago, and it discusses characters that we see in this series. I'm starting to learn that her series all overlap, I think. Like, we see the characters just make cameos in her books, but like that series and the Grip series is like very much intertwined. The characters are very close and we see them in both series. So either way, I went backwards with them, but I read those 2 books and I adored them. I didn't love them as much as Grip and Bristol's stories because they have a special place in my heart, but they had a very similar vibe. It wasn't as hard-hitting, but I think this was like Kennedy Ryan's like coming to the really heavy stuff that she wanted to write. Like, her 2 most recent series have just been so hard-hitting and so vitally important in like today's society to read. And this was like her baby steps to get to that point, because it still tackled some issues, but not to the extreme yet. So the Soul series is Rice's and Kai's series. It's pronounced Rice in the audiobook, even though the name is Reese, like hello, Akatar. But it follows their series. It discusses music a lot, and it discusses some heavy things, but not as triggering as her Hoops or Grip series. But I gave these 4 stars. I still think they were phenomenally done. I was worried to go into her backlist after having read like her more modern stuff, to see if like her writing has evolved over time. And I was only nervous because I was like, what if these books don't live up to my image of her now? I don't want to like taint this image. No, they're just as good. Like, she started amazingly. So I only have her Brothers Bennett series left. And I need to get to those. I think that was her first series, so I'm going to get to those at some point. So that is going to conclude my romance wrap up. If you guys are curious about all of the other books that I read this month, this was 10 out of the 18 that I read in September. So the other 8 are all like the non-romance books that I read. And that covers a lot of like YA and adult contemporary and sci-fi and fantasy and all of those things. So if you're curious about that, that will be coming up next for you guys. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys in part 2, or I don't know, the second part of my wrap up. I'll see you then.